In 1895, the United States government was out of cash. The Treasury's gold reserves had almost entirely dried up, leaving the country hours away from defaulting on its debts. At the time, the country operated without a central bank. If a financial panic struck and investors started hoarding physical gold, there was no federal safety net to catch the falling economy or manage the supply of money. With traditional options exhausted, President Grover Cleveland realized he had to look outside the government for a rescue. He went directly to a private citizen to negotiate a bailout. That citizen was John Pierpont Morgan. He was a towering, heavily built figure with an explosive temper and personal control over an enormous wealth. J.P. Morgan had reached a level of leverage where the survival of the United States depended on his signature. This raises a central question. How did one man gain such unilateral power over a nation, and what would it take for the country to finally move out from under his shadow? Late 19th century American industry was notoriously chaotic. The railroad business, for example, was a mess of competing regional lines constantly slashing their prices to try and steal customers from one another. While most businessmen saw this fierce competition as the natural order of capitalism, Joel P. Morgan hated it. To him, competition meant instability. He believed the only logical way to secure consistent profits was through monopolistic consolidation. He bought out struggling competitors, merging fractured rail lines into a single unified conglomerate to maximize economies of scale. His mandatory condition for investment was total operational control, the authority to sit at the head of the table and fire executives. By swallowing up regional competitors, Morgan eliminated the free market in the nation's most vital infrastructure. He evolved from a wealthy financier into an economic dictator who could unilaterally dictate freight prices for American commerce. Having conquered the railways, Morgan turned his attention toward a larger target, the American steel industry. In 1901, he approached the king of the sector, Andrew Carnegie, and bought his entire empire for $480 million. At the time, it was the most expensive business transaction in history. Morgan merged Carnegie's assets with several other manufacturers to form U.S. Steel, which launched with a market valuation of $1.4 billion. To put that in perspective, the total capitalization of every manufacturing company in the United States combined was only $9 billion. Morgan had effectively privatized the building blocks of a rapidly industrializing nation. His personal investment portfolio had become synonymous with the national economy. This is why President Cleveland had to turn to him during the 1895 crisis. Morgan used a loophole from the Civil War to bypass Congress, formed a private syndicate of bankers, and restocked the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves in 22 minutes. The risks of relying on a private citizen as a national backstop were put to the test during the Panic of 1907. An economic crash sent Americans crowding into the streets to withdraw their life savings, pushing dozens of major banks to the brink of collapse. With the government unable to intervene, Morgan stepped in again. He summoned the nation's top financial executives to the library of his private Madison Avenue estate, and then he physically locked the doors. A 70-year-old Morgan, coughing through a severe cold, refused to let his business rivals leave the room until they agreed to fund his unified financial rescue plan. His tactic forced the required capital into the failing banks and averted a total depression. But the incident revealed that the stability of the entire American economy rested on the health and goodwill of a single, aging man. Public and political opposition began to build. President Theodore Roosevelt led the charge, viewing Morgan's corporate monopolies as an existential threat to American democracy. Morgan was eventually dragged before Congress by the Pujo Committee. They launched a public investigation to map out the reach of Wall Street's money trust and how much influence it held over the nation's finances. The investigation's findings proved that the United States could no longer afford to outsource its economic stability to wealthy individuals. These revelations directly catalyzed the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, shortly after Morgan's death. His original banking house has continued his strategy of consolidation, absorbing competitors to become J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the world by market capitalization. J.P. Morgan built the architecture of the modern megacorporation, but his legacy goes further. By exercising his power so unilaterally, he forced the government to construct a permanent regulatory state, designed to ensure no single individual could ever hold that much leverage again.